I was finding it. So good afternoon, colleagues and guests of the University of Durham. I want to welcome you to the Professor Christine Merrell Annual Methods Lecture. And I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about this program. It's an annual methods lecture in honor and memory of our esteemed colleague, Professor Christine Merrell, who was a professor here at Durham University in the School of Education and the Deputy Executive Dean for Research in the Faculty of Social Sciences and Health. Professor Merrell was also integral in setting up the Research Methods Center here at Durham and is a very missed colleague. Each annual lecture focuses on methods and has a different focus every year. Last year, it was the first time that we hosted this event, and we had first Professor Peter Timmins that is here today, also celebrating the work of Professor Merrell, and then Professor Kate Pickett from the University of York, then hosted a lecture on methodological challenges for promoting social justice. This year, we continue with the same objective to discuss timely and current methods. And the focus of this year's lecture is on complexity perspectives. The lecture was going to originally be delivered by Professor Lasse Grettit, the academic director of the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Sadly, due to ill health, he cannot be here with us today. But we have found an equally, if not more, esteemed colleague to deliver this year's lecture. So we have our own Professor Brian Castellani, who is a professor of sociology at Durham University and also the director of the Durham Research Methods Center. Has numerous publications and numerous research projects to talk about. But today is going to focus on his latest book, entitled The Atlas of Complexity.
All right, brilliant. All right, that means it was worth it, or I better earn my money. Okay, so as I was saying, Lasse wanted to very much extend his apologies for not making it. And I do want to thank those who are online for attending as well. Laura will be monitoring chat online. So if you have questions, you can throw them up there and then Laura will feed them to Christine when she MCs the event. So the title of the presentation is Complexity Perspectives on Causality and Evidence. So there's a nice picture of Lasse. I thought that was pretty impressive, doing the lecturing style photograph. So this is the Atlas of Social Complexity. So Lasse and I have been working on this for probably almost 5 years now. What we sought to do was not to map or outline what has already taken place within the complexity sciences, but to really map where social complexity was going or is going in its potential avenues. Obviously, given that one of the foci for that is this issue of causality. So what I'll be talking to you about is basically what Lasse would have been talking to you about, which is our particular take on complexity based on what we see as the more innovative or cutting edge or leading edge approaches that seem to be emerging presently. But I do want to set up a couple caveats for the purposes of discussion. The way we'll go is how this will work is I'll finish talking, we'll take some questions, then Jen and Jonathan will do a bit of a panel, and then we'll turn it back out to the audience again after I sort of respond. And we'll just try to create a dialogue, which I find more interesting in the end than just me talking. But having said that, to sort of set up some of the ground rules for me, at least intellectually, is I don't believe there's any one approach to complexity. So I'm not up here to say my approach to complexity or the approach that Lasse and I are outlining is necessarily the best one per se. It happens to be the one that we find most useful. That's not to say that all approaches are equal, but it's certainly to say there is a pluralism that goes along with complexity and also causality. And context is key, which I'll be talking about. So this is our argument. This is what basically I'll outline what I'm going to say here in this single slide, and then spend the rest of the lecture discussing that. So first thing, most health and social science topics, when it comes to the issue of complexity, I'll be arguing benefit from a transdisciplinary framing of causality. That it's best grounded in what we could call complex realism, which we'll talk a bit about, and also situated within a complex systems perspective. And that we would like to take a case-based configurational approach, I'll explain that more specifically, which employs interdisciplinary methods to think about causality, and that develops multiple models, not the idea of a singular model, but multiple models for understanding a causal system. And that embraces co-production, that people, the stakeholders that are part of what it is you're studying are involved in from the beginning. And this is another thing too, which comes from a colleague of mine, Federica Russo, who is at University of Amsterdam. And Federica, we're hoping will be coming here next year to put on a series on philosophy of complexity with our own Alex Broadbent here at Durham University and Andrea Hurst from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. This idea of recognizing, Federica argues, different evidence sources for decision-making. Simple, what a physician needs to make a decision versus in a court of law versus somebody who's buying a home. All these different ideas of what evidence is necessary or sufficient for making decisions about what causes what. And then this issue of equifinality or multifinality, which we will also spend some time talking about. And then finally, modeling multiple trajectories and multiple outcomes. So in a nutshell, that's the argument that I'll be making today, but we'll go in depth into that quickly. So this idea of a transdisciplinary framing, if you think about causality and you dig into the morass of literature on it, you're up against a considerable tome of work. You've got ontology, you've got epistemology, you've got theories of counterfactuality and public policy, you've got probabilistic causation, causality in everyday language. You've got cognitive reasoning, right? We have issues around cognitive behavioral, the way in which the mind works, right? The way we make decisions about what causes what. Who do I believe? What do I think is the source of this problem? We see behavioral discounting as an example, all these sorts of things. So there's a way in which, from an evolutionary perspective, even our brains are wired to think about causality. A good example that's given is during maritime, the idea that there was knowledge that the way the moon was positioned had some relationship to tides, but there was no actual understanding of a Newtonian perspective on what that was. So people make these connections cognitively. Then there's medical diagnosis, experimental design, and decision-making within organizations. So all of these different perspectives demand different understandings of causality. And so right from the get-go, if we were to just have a philosophical discussion about causality, it would be just that, just a philosophical discussion of causality, because in reality, other perspectives or other ways of understanding causality are important. And in our work in the DRMC, the Durham Research Methods Center, this is key because we're attempting to develop methods that assist decision-making. So you have to think about who's making the decision and what sort of decision they're making, and embracing this multiple approach perspective. So the conclusion on this is we need to work across disciplines and approaches to causality. Far too many conferences that I've been at, and I'm sure a number of you have been at, where people sit there and split hairs over one definition of causality over another and engage in polemics. That's fine and dandy, but in reality, how in the real world do we get on with doing the work we need to do, knowing that people have different perspectives? David Byrne is in the audience today, colleague here at Durham University, Emeritus. David, myself, and Emma Upritchard, a colleague of ours, been at Warwick. We held a 3-year seminar ESRC seminar where we had in the room everybody, physicists, artists, social scientists, to try to discuss this basic issue, right, of causality and complexity. And we never agreed on anything, almost, right? But what's that? It was good fun. And, you know, it was a nice way to spend some ESRC money. But we did come to the conclusion that there were ways that we could learn how to talk as opposed to arguing 9 different definitions of nonlinearity. So we need to work across disciplines and approaches to causality. But I'm not an additive person. So I don't believe that necessarily that dialogue, and this would be something for us to chat, you know, as a group, is I don't think that means that you have to be nice. I think we need to interrogate and challenge each other's perspectives on these issues. So, for example, my background is as a clinical psychologist for 10 years, working as a clinician in mental health. And oftentimes this was the discussion was the psychiatrists that I work with, somebody would come in, they would present with some sort of mental illness. They would define the cause within a very, very narrow, restricted definition of causality. And then I would challenge them to think about social context and place and employment and job stability and income stability. It wasn't that they were wrong on their causality. It was just that their causality was limited to a certain bracket, to a certain level. So this idea of interrogating or challenging, and then at the same time looking for common ground. Now, I'm not a philosopher. So for those of you who are much more adept at complex realism, you can fill in the gaps here. But the argument that I'll be pulling from here is from Malcolm Williams. We have a series with Routledge, again, David and I and Emma and Lassa on complexity. And Malcolm wrote a book for us. Malcolm's down at Cardiff. Sort of trying to outline what is a complex realist perspective. And again, there is no one perspective per se. But I like Malcolm's argument where he says complex realism, in his hands at least, is not deep philosophy. We're not after a deep philosophical argument. What we're really thinking about is methods and taking a methodological focus. So it's philosophy for methodologists. I think there's a lot to be said for everybody now has data science degrees, right? Just about every university in the world, you can go get a degree in data science. But absent from a lot of those programs are critical thinking, right? A real thoughtfulness about how do you actually think about causality? How do the models you use impact causality? So critical or complex realism is more this idea of a philosophy for methodologists. And it asserts that the science of the social is possible. And that's where the realism aspect comes in. But the world is not, the social world is not natural necessity. So it's not, we're not dealing with canon laws, right, that you have in, say, physics or something. But the social world is probabilistic. There are patterns, there are ways of understanding things. And it's probabilistic because it's complex. So social reality, along with most of reality, therefore, is from a complex realist perspective, ontologically complex. So we're taking the assumption that the social worlds that we're dealing with are fundamentally complex. Given this complexity, reality cannot be contained within any one model or set of laws. That becomes key as well. So if the world that we're studying is complex, you're not going to get it to fit into one particular model. All models are underdetermined by their evidence in that respect. So we need more than one model, and we need a complex systems framing. If the world is ontologically complex, if causality is complex, then the modeling for that, by definition, needs to be complex. So that'll be embracing a complex systems view of reality. And then we need the tools to do that then, which takes us to this issue of a complex systems perspective. For those of you who know me well, you've seen this map ad nauseum. This is a map of the complexity sciences. And you see down along the bottom row, going from left to right, it's a rough historical outline. You see the majority of the bottom are methods. Fritjof Capra, in his book, Web of Life, argues that in many ways, the complexity sciences are a methodological revolution as opposed to a theoretical. It's not as if we didn't know the world was complex, right? It was the question of could we model it in more complex and sophisticated ways? And a lot of the methods that are within the complexity sciences are just that, better ways of handling complexity, from network science to simulation to artificial intelligence to some qualitative methods like QCA, which is qualitative comparative analysis, systems mapping, participatory systems mapping, and so forth. But then you also see, in addition to methods, right through the middle, starting with complex system theory from the left to the right, these would be what we would call the core concepts within complexity science: emergence, self-organization, resilience, swarm behavior, and so forth. So the complexity sciences very much embrace a new set of tools that are grounded on this principle that reality is ontologically complex, so therefore causality is complex, and therefore needs to be modeled in complex ways. Now, however, having said that, and this is online, if you just type in map of complexity sciences, and you can click on any of these things and go down the rabbit hole, so to speak, as they say. That doesn't mean everything within complexity is the same. Not all complexity scientists think similarly. There's a part of the reason Lasse and I have written the book, The Atlas of Social Complexity, is just because we feel that in many ways, the complexity sciences are falling into a lot of the old traps that conventional science was already trapped within, and the complexity sciences had emerged to, in large measure, break free from. Edgar Morin, the French philosopher, sociologist, who I almost got the chance to meet down in Montpellier when I was down at a conference. You think he's 100 now, 101, and I was part of the reason I agreed to go to my colleague Christophe down to Montpellier was to see Morin, and he got sick. I was like, damn him. Anyways, Morin makes this distinction between what he calls restricted complexity and general complexity. Now, again, this isn't the only distinction, but these are at least is one easy way of demonstrating different approaches to causality or complex causality, even within the complexity sciences. So Morin says a restricted complexity is following more of the conventional science, more of a Newtonian reductionist approach, where even though we're modeling complex systems, the goal is still to find proper laws that explain everything. So we can go from, say, the way in which the planets orbit the whatever, and orbit the sun, thank you, to swarming behavior, to ant colonies, to human cities. So you see a lot in this map. Up at the top, for example, mathematics of complexity, nonlinear systems, fractal, geometry, chaos theory, physics of complex systems, resilience, scaling laws. A lot of this is of that restricted complexity perspective, where it's still trying to do old school science with the idea that the world is complex, but now we have the tools. What's interesting in terms of causality is in the 1990s, when the complexity turn took place in the social sciences, it came out of postmodernism and out of a postmodern critique of the conventions of science. If you go back to Lyotard's Postmodern Condition book, he actually leans on chaos theory, catastrophe theory, and the complexity sciences to argue for the limits of what we can know scientifically. Somehow in the process, we went back to the idea, well, actually, we do have the tools to do it, and we just need to use those tools. That's a restricted approach. General complexity, which will be the one I'll be advocating for, is always interested in the relationship between the whole and the parts. So when you think about causality, you have the things in the system doing what they're doing, right? So you have the brain, and you have the brain doing the things that brain does at, say, a physiological level around neurodegenerative disorders or so on and so forth. But then you have the gestalt, the mind, the brain in process, the brain acting. And that gestalt is a different level of complexity. And Christopher Lasch, I think, made a really nice distinction when cognitive psychology was beginning to sort of say most Freudian ideas were garbage. And that's not to say there's not a lot of problems with Freud. But Lasch made this really interesting point. He said, cognitive science studies the brain. Therapists talk about how the brain understands itself as mind. And I thought that was a really, so when Freud says it, I, thou, or, talks about these different motifs, it's our human brains, right, in a way that we can understand what's happening to us. It's at a different level of emergence. It's at a different level of complexity. So one of the challenges you have when it comes to complex systems perspective is if you are arguing causality, at what level? And does that explanation hold when that system is self-organized and emergent, right? So this becomes the challenge with reductionist approaches to causality, because if they're not taking into account the whole, they're always up against limitations in terms of the explanations that they can provide. But you can't just stay at the level of the whole either. You have to move back and forth. So this idea of general complexity. The other thing too is critical complexity around this issue of causality. There was a article just written about Santa Fe Institute and talking about how a lot of Santa Fe Institute approaches to causality with this notion of self-organization, and the idea of things from the bottom, emerging from the bottom up, is actually quite a conservative approach that in so much as the argument is focused on how things function. So for those of us in sociology or social science, this is a form of functionalism, right? So if Google gives you, $10 million American to go do a research study, you're probably not going to get into causal issues around intersectionality or power relations, and you're probably going to explain things based on the way in which things function, right? So there's this certain aspect to things within complexity, again, coming out of a physics background, that has not thought about causality in terms of issues of hierarchies, conflicts, inequalities. Is anybody in here in organizational studies? Sort of, anybody? One of the things, that came out of the organizational studies literature, right? So they started talking about, you work in institutes. Let's take our university, Durham University. Everything that happens at Durham University, it'll emerge from the ground up. And these emergent self-organizing patterns. We know in reality that we have bosses, right? Our bosses tell us what to do. And there are rules. And we work with lots of dysfunctional colleagues, right? We deal with environments that are difficult. This is what people do on a daily basis, right? So if you're not thinking about hierarchies and conflicts and oppression and resistance and relations of power, your approach to causality is a bit challenged. Now, what we've seen in the work that we've been doing is a shift to, instead of studying causality within, like you're studying a social system, studying causality from within the system. In other words, the idea of thinking about causality in terms of life within the system. Now, even though this is a newer trend in some ways, it's actually a bit old school because it was socio-cybernetics, second order cybernetics emerging, saying basically, once like this system here, you're reacting to what I'm saying, right? So as I'm talking, your brain is reacting to what I'm saying. You're not water or sand. So the systems adapt, they respond. And so really to understand the idea that we live within systems and that our understanding of causality is also therefore position. So then you get into standpoint theory and intersectionality as examples of struggling to understand the causal mechanisms within the structures you're exploring, given the position you have within them. So coming from that perspective is this idea of embracing a general approach to general and critical approach to complex systems and causality, and then thinking about these things that I've been listing. From there, we move to what we could say is a case-based approach. So this would be a specific approach that David and Charles Reagan and others have developed initially, which is thinking about complexity from a particular vein. If you looked at the map of complexity sciences, it sits right over here in terms of case-based approaches. These are some books, one by David and Charles Reagan, by Reagan and Benoit Rioux, Configuration Comparative Methods, and then a book that I just published with my colleague Rajiv Rajaram, who's a mathematician in the States. So the argument here that I want to make around causality is this, that first of all, these would be your three basic tenets, that cases and their trajectories across time are the focus of the study, not individual attributes or variables. I don't study variables when I do my work. I study configurations. I study variables in relationship to one another, and I'm thinking about them as they're evolving across time space. So if you think about a lot of social science data, and then when I got into the world of policy evaluation, I was even more surprised at the absence of data. That a lot of data is static. They're small data sets, and they're not particularly dynamic, and they're certainly not configurational. So when it comes to building a model of causality out of that kind of data, we are very much restricted or limited in terms of how we understand things. And we see this over and over again in political elections, right? These timestamp moments, who's going to win? Really, what happens today may not, and most oftentimes doesn't have anything to do with what happens tomorrow, because we're not studying the surveys across time per se, and how the dynamics of these surveys are changing, as an example. So also thinking about cases and their relationships, right? Probably one of the first really good examples of that was a work by Christakis and Fowler on the Framingham heart study in the States, where they were looking at obesity across time. And here what they were concerned with is not just the weight gain or weight loss of the individuals in this community, but the relationships between those individuals and the impact those relationships had on weight gain or weight loss. So if you again think about causality, you think about how we think about causality in social science, oftentimes our data sets have nothing to say much about the relationships amongst the people in those data sets. This was really hit home for us. We did a study on the comorbid relationship between depression and physical health in Australia. It's one of the largest naturalistic studies of depression in the world. A colleague of mine, Jane Goodman, at Melbourne, and it was a 7-year period, and it was about year 4, all the data went flat. And we could not figure out what the heck had happened till it dawned on Jane that it was a year of one of the big fires in Australia. And so just like COVID, right, knocking depression indices off, right? I mean, mental health data will be a mess for a long time, right, as a result of COVID. Same thing with the fires happening there. There's relational and contextual aspects to causality that need to be considered. So in addition to this, we're thinking about trajectories. This will go to this issue of multifinality and equifinality, that systems don't produce one outcome. So when we think about a lot of the causal models that we build, right, from a more traditional statistical perspective, we build a model of causality that explains 65% of the variance in the study and roughly maybe 80% of the population in that study. That would be phenomenal, right? But the reality is there's lots of different outcomes happening in any given data set. In my area with clinical decision making, this becomes really important. Say, for example, someone's diagnosed with cancer or someone's diagnosed with heart disease, and you start off with the traditional treatment that everybody's agreed upon because that's the best causal model for do this intervention and this outcome will happen. After that doesn't work, then you consider alternative treatments. Because there was no initial thought about the configurational differences amongst the people in your population and how those by definition lead to different outcomes right from the get-go. So even from a clinical decision-making perspective or policy-making perspective, the idea that you need more than one pathway, you need to understand more than one causal trajectory through a particular system. So again, this idea that cases cluster up and form patterns is important. So just a bit more, what is this notion of a case then? It's an abstract description of qualitative and quantitative characteristics that are configurational in nature. And also cases are agents doing things. This is a really important point too. When we think about oftentimes causality, we tend to treat the individuals, organizations, or whatever in our data set as if they were things that things happen to, right? And if you look at the traditional definition of causality, that's what it is. A impacts B. But in the real world, things, right, are impacting each other simultaneously. It's recursive. And people and agents, whatever they be, countries, organizations, whatever, they do things. So causality, or the idea of causality being dynamic and in process, as opposed to the sort of simple diagrams that we get, cases do things, and so they need to be studied in that respect. I won't bother with this mathematical definition of cases per se, but this just gives you an example of, this is from the Welsh indices of multiple deprivation. So if you just took this one, authoritative Conway, and looked at the case profile across, that would be an example of a configuration. Thinking about how all of those factors go together to influence what's taking place in that particular area. And then you'll see a lot of the new tools that have emerged then as a result of taking this approach to thinking about complex causality is around clusters and classification. Back to critical or complex realism, the idea that the social world is probabilistic. What we find is there are patterns, there are discernible patterns. There are ways of understanding, and we see this. Let's take the UK, right? So I've had the fortune of living in the States, now resident in the UK, and I spent a lot of time in the Netherlands. I do constant comparisons across all three countries, right? And there's certain narratives there. There's certain things that Americans do. There's certain things that we do here in the Northeast. There's certain things that happen in Rotterdam and Amsterdam, where I spent a lot of time. So it's not as if these patterns don't have their own life, right? Their own existence. So even though the world is highly dynamic, at the same time, there's a lot of stability in these processes. So clustering profiles have been used for just that. Has anybody been, for example, been using the new chat bots? Anybody explored those? They're all right? But they're there for patterns, right? So I just came back from South Africa, so I had a 13-hour flight, and I spent the 20 pounds to get the Wi-Fi on the plane. I was like going to go out of my mind. I can't watch movies because I have hearing impairment, so I can't like sit there. Everybody's watching movies. So I'm like, I'm going on Wi-Fi. So I started playing chatbot. The first thing I did, what do you guess the first thing I did was? I looked up my name. Put in brackets, Brian Castellani, nothing. I was like, all right, this thing's crap. Right? But then I put in topics that I know. So I started throwing in some different topics, and some it did pretty good. And I noticed the less common the theme, the greater the difficulty, because it had the machinery had, the algorithms had less time to learn. They were still learning. And actually, what was kind of cool with the chatbot is every single time, for those of you who've tried it, you can give the thing feedback. How was this? What missed? What was right? What was going? So it's learning from you interacting with it as well. So a lot of these clustering techniques, be they traditional things like k-means or more advanced things like artificial neural nets, are trying to do this. They're trying to find the centers. They're trying to find the commonalities within groups. So here, even though within this clustering, you're already looking at 3 different versions of causality, even in a simple cluster analysis. You have 3 different versions of causality that exist there. They're variants off the same theme. And again, because David's my mentor and he's sitting right there, I'm going to keep doing this. But in the book that David and Charles Reagan did, you can talk later about it, is comparing of school systems. One of the things in QCA, for example, qualitative comparative analysis, is that if some set of factors explain success or some factors explain failure, they may not be the same factors. So one of the things that David had done a study was amongst, and this will resonate with you, Peter, is amongst, and you too, Christina, is amongst schools that are poor performing, which ones were doing slightly better? Because there's no point really in studying high performing schools in rich neighborhoods with leafy communities, because the likelihood of being able to transfer that set of causal explanations down to poor schools. What's more interesting is amongst schools that are poor performing, are we seeing some things among certain schools that demonstrate some degree of success or improvement? And those are the sorts of things that you can go after policy-wise. And that's the difference, I think, in these approaches, is you're not interested in one-size-fits-all causal explanations for things. And we happen to use AI for this sort of stuff. And what's nice about this is it gets more sophisticated because you can actually get your net. So when it's called a neural net, they mean it. You know, you're really netting the data, so to speak. Whereas a traditional cluster analysis is popping a centroid in the middle of something. A neural net is actually trying to position its points around the data set. And this was like an example of a data set looking at all the words on Wikipedia as an example. And then this was a data set we did on that comorbid depression and physical health that I mentioned. Again, looking at a topographical net for understanding the data. Now, what's really cool about that also is that you never lose the complexity. If you look at that upper right, that's called a SOM grid or self-organizing map grid. And what's key about that is every single case in the study is up there. So you have never lost track of any single case. You know where that case is situated. And you know the people that are, in this case, they're people who are similar to that case, who are sitting near them. And then you get boundaries and peaks and troughs you see in that bottom side view that shows you the degree of difference between this group of people and this group of people. So we ended up with over 11 different causal explanations for these cases. And then we were able to, I'll show you this over here. We were then able to track them across time as well, to take those trajectories and watch how they evolved across time. So not just to locate people, but to watch how where they were changed. So these methods are quite powerful as approaches. And so just to kind of keep the time here, this idea of interdisciplinary methods, which we've mentioned, it becomes exceptionally important. An article by a colleague of ours, Peter Barbara Johnson and Jane Carrick, what they were looking at in this article was which methods work well together, under what conditions, and they build a network model of it to look at how these different methods in the literature as a sort of a meta-analysis configure around each other. And then also colleague Celia Lurie down at Warwick as well have an excellent book on the Routledge Handbook of Interdisciplinary Research Methods. That's different from mixed methods. Mixed methods is traditionally some qualitative put together with quantitative, whereas interdisciplinary methods is thinking about methods across disciplines. And our center, the DRMC, this is what we have taken as a position. These are the three areas that we're focused on around interdisciplinary methods, which is trying to tackle complex real-world problems, navigating the global methods landscape, and then providing interdisciplinary methods for knowledge advancement. And a lot of this has to do with assisting decision-making. And again, thinking about multiple models from multiple levels. In the book on Atlas of Social Complexity, one of the things we notice is that people study, even the complexity scientists, they'll study at a certain level, but they won't hook that level up to a level beneath it or above it. So you might study, say, the classroom, but not the school system, or you study the school system, but you don't study the funding organizations or the larger country and its educational policy. How would you connect all three of those levels together? And then this issue of co-production. I've had the good fortune of working with colleagues in what's called CCAN, which is the Center for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. And for me, this was a huge change in the way I do my work, because I had never really actually been engaged with the very people that I'm trying to help, or the people that are constructing policy or thinking about policy. And you realize from an organizational perspective that when you actually sit down with people and do what some form of systems mapping, you find everybody has different interpretations of what's happening. So if we took you as students and colleagues here and we sat down and I said, map out Durham University in terms of its causal structure, we would all have different maps that we would construct. And then the question would be, how can you put those maps together to form a common mapping or a common understanding, and then use that then to make decisions about how you would make interventions or change. So building these systems models and thinking about causality from a co-production perspective becomes quite challenging. And co-production isn't the be-all and end-all either. There's lots of challenges associated with co-production, because you do get into conflict around different ideas of what is happening, so to speak, and how do you resolve those conflicts for purposes of moving forward. Then finally, this issue of evidence sources that I just want to mention. Thinking about a healthcare provider making a clinical decision, a policymaker deciding which intervention, student making a career choice, engineer deciding when a plane is ready to fly. These become different forms of evidence. And I think this is important because we may argue, against causality or the capacity to understand the real world, certain instances, but for example, when I got to Heathrow to fly to Johannesburg, the pilot got on, and you don't want to hear a pilot say this, in my 25 years of flight, I have never seen the following happen. And that was the software for running the plane had crashed. Oh my God. I know pilots are like astronauts, they're trained to tell the truth, but this was a little too much truth, right? And it was amazing, my view of causality, suddenly changed very, very much. And they did the same thing when we got to Johannesburg, because Johannesburg sort of sits in a basin. It was complete fog. And, you have that sense when the airplane's going down. And all of a sudden we were coming back up. And I'm like, okay, what's going on? He comes on, he says, we got 45 minutes of fuel left. Again, don't tell me this. Because we can either land this plane and we're going to land on a runway that's barely legal, or we're going to some city off the coastline, the East Cape or West Cape. And again, different notions of causality, right, are going through your head, different ideas of what is the necessary evidence. What does barely legal runway mean? These sorts of things. So again, and I think this became very evident in COVID. For a lot of us who were involved in the COVID modeling, Jen, for example, myself working with Camila and others here at Durham, it was quite anxiety producing, because I'm not used to people asking me to tell them something and they're going to actually do it. As academics, we're always like, oh, if people would only listen to us. And then all of a sudden they were listening, and it was terrifying, right? Weekly reports, that we were sending and submitting, and it was amazing, right, Jen? I mean, it got real fast. Matter of fact, what I did was I called Jen and I said, can you please help me? So again, I think what we think of as sufficient or necessary evidence changes based on what it is that we're attempting to deal with. And that goes to this issue, finally, of equifinality and multifinality. Another aspect that's not strongly considered when we think about causality, which is equifinality, is the idea that different initial conditions can lead to the same outcome. And this becomes a real issue around counterfactuals, as an example, or the opposite, that similar beginnings lead to different and multiple outcomes at the end. So you've got this challenge of equifinality and multifinality, which then it goes to this idea then of modeling different types of trajectories. So again, to summarize, I'm not saying this is the only approach to causality, but certainly it's been the approach that we've been developing over the past 5 years, and have certainly noticed within the literature a shift towards, as Stephen Hawking famously said, science in the 21st century is about complexity. And I think that was very prescient on his part. And so I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for such a wonderful talk. Before I invite Jonathan and Jen to come and provide their comments to the lecture, I'll give an opportunity if there's any kind of aspect that you need to clarify with Brian. We will then open up for questions for Brian as well. If there's any aspect of the lecture that you need to clarify at this stage. If not, I'll invite Jonathan and Jen to come in.
I've got the microphone, so I'll go first. Yeah, so thanks very much. I guess, one thing I was thinking about the talking and complexity generally is, and again, something Dave mentions is the language of complexity, which Brian has introduced here in relation to things like causality and complexity. And I think that's a real sort of contribution of the field for me, is much more of a qualitative research. Things like talking about the trajectory of systems makes a lot of sense to me. You can see that certain things move in particular directions, and then what occurs within them is very complex. So I'm really interested in health inequalities research. And you could argue that in the UK, we've been through a phase shift in terms of the types of inequalities we have in societies. And people then, in the language of complexity, would describe that as a particular possibility space, an attractor around which things can be done. And then there are some quite sort of simple solutions to health inequalities. A lot of it is behavioural. We know what causes a lot of people to die younger or live a much longer period of their life in poor health. And the solutions are really quite simple in the sense you should not do certain things, and you should do more of other things. So you shouldn't drink excessively, you shouldn't smoke, you should, exercise a lot more. But people don't follow that advice. And the reason they don't follow that advice is because their lives are really complex, and we situate them within complex systems and within complexity and space. And that's what I find, like, as a non sort of stats person, a non-quantitative person, I've got a bit of literacy on those things, but I'm really not advanced. Although I could, no, I'm joking. I could beat you in a maths test, Jen. But no, and you, no, neither. But the point is that creates something for me where I can then understand the qualitative nature of these systems and the world that we live in, and the, as I say, sort of the trajectory of those things, all of the mess that exists within that. And then there are still patterns, real strong patterns that emerge from all of that complexity too. But yeah, that's my initial response. So thank you, and thank you for the talk.
Thank you both. As I was listening to Brian, I was reflecting on how I got into complexity in the first place. A very long time ago, I'm older than you think. I was originally trained in mathematics, and I joined the Australian Department of Health. And I joined the Department of Health because they needed somebody to, I was working on stopping tobacco advertising. They needed somebody to interpret the science that the tobacco industry was presenting to the department, that, you know, tobacco advertising doesn't cause kids to take up smoking and it shouldn't be banned. Okay? And they misunderstood and thought that I actually knew something about statistics, which I don't. But they wanted somebody who was mathematically competent to help them deal with this. And that got me into the policy space, which is an unusual space for a mathematician to be in. And I spent 15 or so years working in policy. And during that time, I was working on things that were often in the too hard basket, where there was big disagreements about the way to move forward. And that got me very heavily into thinking about what are the social mechanisms, the social processes by which things happen that get entrenched in society, and how can we fix them? And the things that really resonated for me was in the policy space, you're thinking about making decisions to change something about a world you don't fully understand, a complex world, and you're thinking about what's the path that you want to come out of your policy change, but what are the other possible paths that might happen, what trajectories might happen, and what can you do to identify when you're going down the wrong path? How can you detect that early? How can you actually work out what those potential paths might be? And the thing that really resonated for me was the co-production. It's very common in Australia, in particular, when I was working in policy in the 80s and 90s, that we had a very well-funded consumer input into our policy decision processes. And co-production was part of our policy development, just automatically. And when I moved to the UK, I started working on models of epidemic models. And I said, okay, so who are the consumer reps that you work with in thinking about these processes? And I was unable to find anybody. It wasn't part of the process. And what that co-production brought to the table was different perspectives in the way that you would expect about priorities and so on. Different understandings of what's important. Different understandings of the way that the world is set up, what the causal paths are, and different understandings of the potential solutions. And I think that lack of co-production was something that is being overcome. But to me, that's that interdisciplinarity and different perspectives on what is knowledge and integrating it in some way is really fundamental to the way of making progress in complex systems. It's not necessarily about the complexity itself, but it's about understanding different facets of the complex system so that you can make progress.